This is the last section of our slideshow, and we're going to talk now about what are some of the kinds of evidence that support the idea that living things have changed over time. Remember, this is a theory, and theories take evidence from all kinds of places, all different areas, all different, and tie it together into one big idea. So this is not all the evidence, but there kind of gives you a little example of some different areas that we have evidence from. And what we're going to do is make a list, and then we're going to go through and talk about each one. So number one, something called artificial selection. Number two, fossil record. Number three, geographic distribution. Where are all the different animals on the planet? Something called homologous structures. We saw that word before when we talked about homologous chromosomes. Similar, not exactly identical, but similar structure, similar shape, carry genes for the same traits. Something called embryology. That ending at the end, ology, means the study of something. So study of embryos. DNA. When Darwin came up with his theory, he didn't know about DNA, chromosomes, he didn't know about genes, he didn't know about how traits were passed. But since that time, there's been a ton of evidence that supports the idea that living things have changed over time. And lastly, we can see it happen. We see natural selection happening still today on our planet. So let's talk about those things on the list when we're talking about nature and how you inherit the traits that you. Nature provides the variety. Remember Darwin's idea of variation in populations. That comes through genetics. It comes through things like mutation causing changes in the DNA. We talked about that back in our DNA chapter, in our chromosomes, our mitosis chapter. We talked about the idea of sexual reproduction, mixing them up during meiosis, crossing over, independent assortment, mixing those genes up in different combinations, random fertilization, which sperm gets together with which egg, provides variety in the population. But in artificial selection, the first thing on our list, humans are selecting for the traits that they find use. Example, if you compare cows today to cows 100 years ago, say, if you had a cow on your farm, those cows produced way less milk 100 years ago than they do today. Cows today have been bred over time to be good milk producers. If you're a farmer and you make money from selling the milk your cows make, you want to make sure that your cows make as much milk as they can. And so cows have been bred, modern cows have been bred over many, many years by choosing the best milkers every year. If you're going to breed cows, you want to breed the ones that make the most milk. And over time, we've increased milk production dramatically. Same with turkeys that if you compare modern turkeys, a butterball turkey that you buy at the grocery store with the little pop-up timer and that have been bred on turkey farms, compared to a wild turkey, wild turkeys have way less meat. They're scrawnier, they're not as big. Surveys say the average American population likes the best is the white meat. And turkeys, modern turkeys, butterball turkeys, have been bred over years and years and years to always picking the turkeys to breed that have the biggest chest muscle. And nowadays turkeys have a huge, sometimes that turkeys are so big they can hardly walk, they fall over, they tip over because they're so top heavy. It's because they've been chosen by farmers over time to have those qualities that we like. Not only can we do it with animals, we do it with plants. If you look at these common vegetables that you eat every day, things like broccoli, cauliflower, Brussels sprouts, cabbage, they all can be traced back to the same ancestor. They come from the wild mustard plant, but they look very different today, and that's because farmers have chosen to breed for certain characteristics, bigger leaves, different kinds of flowers, and bred for those traits over many, 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 many years. And now we have plants that look very different from that ancestor plant and very different from each other. And it's because humans have selected those traits and bred for them. What Darwin would say is if we can do it with farmers picking the characteristics, the beneficial traits that they like, why wouldn't the same thing work if nature is picking? Think about dogs. Artificial selection. We have bred dogs from a wolf ancestor, but dogs nowadays look very different from each other. We've bred them to have short legs, to be hunters and go into flush out game out of burrows. We've bred them for we've bred them for retrieving. If artificial selection, humans picking the traits that they like, can change organisms, why can't nature doing the same thing cause changes in populations? And Darwin knew about this idea. One of the things that rich people did in those days, and probably still do today, is breeding animals. Horse breeding is a big venture now. Darwin's mother was a pigeon breeder before she died. Remember, she died when he was very young, but he would help her with take care of the pigeons, and people would breed pigeons. They bred horses, and we have done the same thing for thousands and thousands of years. And so remember at the beginning of the slideshow, I asked you to keep an eye out for what some common foods that you know have to do with evolution, and now you know what broccoli and butterball turkeys have to do with evolution. They have been artificially selected for. They've been bred by humans to have characteristics that they have. Number 2 on our list is fossil record. And fossils, remember, are the remains of ancient organisms. So we find them in layers of rock. We found them. We're still finding them today. South Dakota is a big fossil state. If you've ever been to the Mammoth Dig out West River, out by Rapid, we find fossils all the time. The largest T-Rex fossil so far has been found in South Dakota. So fossils are a huge record of how living things have changed over time. We can see the remains of organisms that lived at one time in the fossil record. And if you look at fossils and how they're laid down, the layers of rock tell a history of the earth. What has happened? What changes have happened to our planet? Remember, we talked about Hutton and Lyell and their idea about the geology forces shaping our planet, changes happening. And the fossils that are in those rocks tell a history of life. Different organisms found in different layers at different times. We can see who was living at the same time. We can see what kind of plants were there, what kind of ecosystem it was, by looking at the fossil record. And fossils, if you think about the idea of how they're changed, if you find 2 fossils together in the same layer, it means that they were laid down at the same time. They're the same age. So if you think about how fossils are made, not all rocks have fossils, not all living things that ever lived have been turned into fossils, but they are a record of organisms and a record of life. So when an organism dies and settles, their bones and bodies, they settle to the bottom, and over time pressure causes those sediments to harden into rock. And when the earth is compressed, sometimes those layers bend, they move. We talked about uplifting, volcanoes, earthquakes, but the rock layers stay together in the sequence that they're laid down. And the oldest layers are laid down first and other rock laid on top. So we have a picture of what happened over time. As the surface erodes then and the layers are uncovered, we find those fossils that were laid down in the rock. How do we
know evolution happens.
Fossils provide the most interesting evidence for evolution, and certainly the most powerful for most people.
I want you to look behind them.
There's an abundance of hard evidence at the molecular, chemical, and anatomical level that evolution happens. But perhaps it's the clues hardened in stone that tell evolution's story most vividly.
Here are the backbones. You can see how big these vertebrae are. The history of life is all a record in fossils. Millions of them, from strata, layer by layer by layer back through time, are all interconnected. Now, partly this layering and succession is how we tell time in geology, but it's also the principal evidence that life has changed through time, that life has evolved through time, that the things living today can all be connected back through time to common ancestors.
These now lifeless dry rocks are gold to paleontologists. They are the puzzle pieces to the origin of one of the most powerful and majestic animals on Earth, the whale.
The evolution of whales has always been sort of a mystery. They're like us in that they're very intelligent. They're mammals. They're warm-blooded. They nurse young and feed them milk. But they're very, very different. I mean, they live in water. They can hear in water. And they swim around like fish. So the question is this. We know that mammals originally evolved on land, yet whales live in the water. How did that shift, how did that evolution happen from life on land to life in the water?
That question consumes paleontologist Phil Gingrich. The evolution of whales has been his passion ever since 1978, when his team unearthed a rock in Pakistan that appeared to have a skull embedded in it.
When we found it, all you could see was the brain case. Well, I thought it was a wolf-like animal with a very small brain. When it was cleaned, the ears were uncovered, and I could see that it had a very characteristic whale ear, and that shows us that what we have is a whale, not a wolf, not a deer, not some other kind of mammal, but a fossil whale.
Gingrich named the whale ancestor Pakicitus. With only its skull as evidence, scientists do not know for sure what the rest of Pakicitus looked like. But some scientists hypothesize that it resembled a modern seal.
Okay, look at this, Bill. Here's this.
Paleontologists look for fossils that have transitional features from one way of life to another. They use these related forms to create a comprehensive picture of evolutionary change. When fossils of related species are located, scientists organize them by their physical similarities. Sometimes these similarities don't evolve all at once, like the whale ear of Pakicitus, which lacks many other whale-like features in its backbone and limbs.
Whales' bodies contain inside them connections or clues to their past. I mean, their mammalian traits are signs of their recent history, but they're also signs of a very ancient history. Take their flippers. On the outside, their flippers look like fish fins, but on the inside, the bones of that flipper are very similar to those in a monkey's arm, in the wing of a bird, and in the limb of a frog.
Egypt today seems an unlikely place for Phil Gingrich to find intermediate whale fossils.
This is Wales Valley in Egypt. You can see behind me there are many hills of sandstone standing above shale. What's important, it's called Valley of Whales because there are about 400 skeletons of whales weathering out here. This was a wide open blue sea with a full range of sea life living in it. A lot of invertebrate shellfish, sharks, about 5 or 6 kinds of whales living here.
Gingrich searches for intermediates with hind limbs and feet to trace back until those feet and hind limbs are as big and fully functional as any 4-footed animal that lives on land.
It is a Basilosaurus. Look at this. Here's the skull, incisors up front, the rest of the teeth come back to here, and then the whole length of the skull is over a meter.
His find, Basilosaurus, had tiny hind legs with a mobile knee and several toes, and lived 35 to 41 million years ago. Here's where scientists place this transitional form on the fossil record. The discovery of another fossil has led scientists to conclude that whales evolved from a land mammal much like this one, called Synonyx. Perhaps its descendants found the water a source of abundant food and a haven from competition. Over millions of years, through variation and selection, front legs became fins, rear legs disappeared, bodies lost fur, and took on their familiar streamlined shape.
Whales show us the sheer creative power of evolution. I mean, from a wolf-like creature to a whale in 10 or so million years is amazing.
Each dig and discovery adds more stone, more bone, more hard evidence for evolution, for the origin of life, for its history here on Earth, and for the evolutionary relationships among all forms of life.
So as you saw in the movie, the layers in the rock give us a history, the sequence of how things have changed over time. And older layers are farther down, younger layers are higher up, and we can tell what kind of organisms were living at different times by looking at where they are in the sequence. We can see what kind of ecosystems were there. You saw in the movie what is now a desert area in Egypt was once a sea with water critters and whales and sharks and fish. We can see that in the records of fossil records in South Dakota. If you've ever been out to the Badlands, which is a very deserty place now, very dry, you can see those rock layers, those layers that become the racing stripes in the rock that were laid down over time. And parts of South Dakota were very different. We can tell from the fossil record, very different than we have today in South Dakota. There were places where there were huge oceans. There were plants that lived here that were more tropical kinds of plants that we would expect to find in places like Florida now. We have evidence of those living here at one time, cycads and other kinds of plants. So the record in rock is a record of what lived at what time and what kind of organisms were there, what kind of ecosystem. We talked about, remember, changing the surface of our planet has changed over time, and why wouldn't the living things that live in those places change along with it? We said one of the things that theories allows you to do is make predictions. And so if the fossil record is a history of change over time, what we would expect to find in that fossil record is that sequence, those transitional fossils that show relatedness between organisms. And that's exactly what we do see. If you look in the fossil record, we find what we call transitional fossils, the in-betweens, the fossils that show the sequence of change, changing openings in skulls, changing between different kinds of organisms. For example, scientists think that the ancestors of amphibians were fish. So if that's true, we should be able to find in the fossil record some organisms that have both characteristics of fish and characteristics of amphibians. And we have found these fossil records.
A turning point in the evolution of life on Earth. 375 million years ago, it was thought that a species of fish left the sea to live on the land. And now, here's the proof. These exclusive pictures are of the fossilized skull of the first ever fish to have made it onto dry land. Underneath its fins, Professor Neil Shubin found these bones, not typical fish bones, but the beginnings of arms and legs.
They correspond to our upper arm bones, to forearm bones, and indeed, not shown in this thing, are bones that correspond to the wrist.
Published in the journal Nature, it's been named Tiktaalik, a little bit like a crocodile, but with just two short limbs with which it used to lift itself out of the water. This is one of the most important fossils ever discovered. Why? Well, it represents that crucial moment in the evolution of life on Earth when fish left the water to become primitive land animals. Life first started in the sea more than 3.5 billion years ago. It was a simple single-cell animal. Fast forward to 600 million years ago, and the first jellyfish emerged. Then the first primitive fish evolved. That led to Tiktaalik, who left the water. Then, a few hundred million years later, this world-changing event led to early mammals, monkeys, and then, eventually, us.
We're dealing with a very ancient piece of our own history. When we're talking about the origin of the elbow and the wrist, or the expanded ribs, or the neck, what we're dealing with is the origin of our neck, our wrist, our ribs.
The lungfish is Tiktaalik's closest relative. Creatures like this develop little legs to move more quickly in shallow water.
Some of those made it onto dry land, and those are the ones that ultimately are our own ancestors.
This momentous discovery is the evolutionary link between fish and humanity. Talat Ghosh, BBC News, Chicago.
Think about the idea that was accepted at the time when Darwin came up with his theory. Remember, he said he didn't want to publish his idea and put it out there at the time because it disagreed with what was accepted by scientists and by the church at the time. Kind of believed that things were created one time, they were put on the planet all at the same time, and they never changed. And what fossil shows, the fossil record should be able to show that pattern, that idea, if it was true. So let's take a look at the fossil record and see what it actually shows. If you think about the idea of things all created at one time, if you looked at the fossil record, then what you'd expect to see in the different layers is some of each kind of organism. Remember, not every animal that lived or plant that lived is going to be turned into a fossil, but if there were organisms from different kinds, each kind of organism living from the very beginning, way back in time, we would expect to see that in the fossil record. Different kinds of organisms in every layer. And that's not what we see in the fossil record. If you look at the fossil record, what we see is the very earliest first traces of animals that show up are the very simplest kinds of animals that we have. The very, what we call invertebrates, things that don't have a backbone, things like sponges, jellyfish, kinds of mollusks, think clams, octopus, squid, arthropods show up then, the insects, crustaceans, starfish, we call the echinoderms. Think about those very simple animals, and in the very lowest layers there's a sequence, kind of a sequential sequence of those very simple invertebrates at the beginning, and then as we move up in the fossil records, fish appear. The very first fish are the very first vertebrates that we see, and when we first start seeing fish in the fossil records, we don't see any of those other kinds of vertebrates. There's no mammals there, there's no birds there, there's just fish and other invertebrates. And as we move up, once an organism appears in the sequence, it continues to show up in layers that are higher and higher up in the rock. But the organisms we see up in the upper layers, things like mammals and birds, are not there at the lower levels in the rock. They didn't live at that time. As we move up through the fossil records, amphibians appear, the first kinds of amphibians. We see reptiles in upper layers above that. Dinosaurs appear. There aren't any dinosaurs down in the lower levels where first fish appeared and where we see those invertebrates. And sometimes organisms are there for a while in the fossil record and then they're gone. They've gone extinct. Things like dinosaurs lived at one time, but they're not here anymore. But we can see evidence for them in the fossil record. After the reptiles are in the layers, we see birds appearing, we see mammals appearing. We don't see humans till those very upper layers. There aren't humans down in those fish layers where the fish first appear. And do we have fish in our upper layers? Yes. Once organisms appear in the record, they're going to appear and be in those upper layers from that point on, unless they go extinct. But what the record shows is different organisms kinds of organisms showing up at different times in our history.
Finally tonight, the story of a great find across a vast stretch of the American West. Some ranchers are finding out there's more income in what's below their land than what's growing or grazing on top of it. Specifically, they are finding dinosaur bones. Lots of them, as we see tonight from NBC's Mark Potter.
In the rugged hills of Montana, on a cattle ranch, paleontologists are recovering the remains of a 75-million-year-old dinosaur.
1, 2, 3.
The fossilized bones are from a Lambeosaurus, also known as a crested duckbill.
This is the front part of the skull pointing toward me. Nose, this would have been the whole snout, but again, right now my hand is where the food would have been when he was chewing.
The bones were discovered by cattle rancher Larry Tuss, who has found remains of 13 dinosaurs on private land.
Looks like there might be a critter if it goes from there to there.
In South Dakota, Bucky Derflinger has also found dinosaur bones on his father's ranch. One day, he stumbled on something huge.
It was a toe bone, a phalange, and it was about that big.
That toe bone led to the discovery of a Tyrannosaurus rex.
When I realized that I'd found a T-Rex, I literally did a backflip.
More and more ranchers are leasing their discovery sites to private fossil companies, which send scientists to study and excavate the bones. When the remains are prepared and sold, usually to museums, the ranchers get a percentage.
It's helped us through some tough times, yeah.
Some paleontologists, though, complain that the ranchers and fossil companies aren't careful enough with the specimens and are more concerned with sales than science.
But at the Rocky Mountain Dinosaur Resource Center in Colorado, experts say those criticisms are unfair.
Profit is not our motivating factor. Interest and love of fossils is what motivates us.
Paleontologist Craig Dersler, who works with the center, says privately funded research is solid.
The science is being done the same as it would be if it was a public expedition.
Scientists and ranchers farming dinosaurs. Mark Potter, NBC News, Winifred, Montana.
So if you look at this idea of change over time in the fossil record, we actually have evidence for those changes, the sequence of how things have changed. The transitional fossils that show the connections between different kinds of organisms. And one of those transitional fossils that you saw in the little video is called Tiktaalik. It's an intermediate between fish ancestors and early, what we call tetrapods, four-legged organisms that moved out onto land, that are beginnings of our first amphibians. If you think about the idea of changing environments like that, you need a different kind of body to live in water compared to live on land. In water, the water supports you and holds you up, but on land you have to be able to move, you have to be able to walk and have support, hold your body up with limbs. And so we need a transition to if you're going to switch where you live. And the idea of an organism that would have some characteristics of fish and some characteristics of amphibians, we see that in that Tiktaalik fossil. They have fins like a fish, but if you look inside their fins, they're not fins like the fish we have in South Dakota that have little spines in their fins. They actually have little mini arm bones and wrist bones and simple fingers inside those fins. if you think about how organisms have to be able to move on land, and fish don't have a neck. Their head doesn't swivel like our head swivels. But Tiktaalik has it's a fish, but it has a neck that can turn its head from side to side like a land animal does. This was discovered in 2004 by Neil Shubin and Ted Deschler, and they are scientists. You saw Neil Shubin in a couple of those videos that we just watched. He's a paleontologist and head of the Field Museum in Chicago. We do see those transitional fossils, the in-betweens that have some characteristics of each kind of organisms that show that link, that ancestor link. If Darwin's theory is correct, what you'd expect to see, and be able to make a prediction, that if you have organisms that are related to each other, closely related organisms, but they're living in different kinds of habitats as they spread to different areas or move into a different place, what we'd expect to see is evolution, change over time in those organisms. And we would expect to find organisms that are related to each other but different because they're living in different places. And that's exactly what we do see. If you look at what Darwin saw when he went to the Galapagos Islands, different kinds of turtles living in different kinds of habitats on different islands. The tortoises are adapted to live in different places. They have characteristics that help them survive in that place. If you think about islands popping up, volcanic islands popping up out of the ocean, those organisms had to have come or moved into those islands from somewhere else. There weren't any, when those islands were formed by volcanic activity, there weren't any organisms living there at first. So where would they come from? They came from the nearest place, the mainland of South America. This is off the coast of Ecuador, remember. Organisms would have moved in, swam across, floated across, got blown in a hurricane, seeds blew with the wind, and settled into those islands and eventually came to live there. And the idea that these tortoises shared a common ancestor from the mainland tortoises, but changed over time to become different as they adapted to the different kinds of habitats where they lived. What kind of rainfall was there? What kind of vegetation was there? This idea of common ancestors changing over time to fit the place where they are living is called divergent evolution. Diverge means to split apart, go different pathways. And organisms that have done that, diverged from a common ancestor, are adapted to live in the places where they have come to live. Another word that means the same thing, vocab, is adaptive radiation. As those organisms radiated out from a common ancestor, they have adapted to the habitats that they're living in, different kinds of necks for the different kinds of vegetation. Was it grow low to the ground? Is it high up? Do we have to reach for it? That idea of common ancestors but changing to become different is very common. We see it in the distribution of animals and where they live on the planet. If you look at the other organisms that are common on the Galapagos, finches. Darwin collected 14 different species of finches when he was there. And if you look at the birds, they look different. They're different species. And again, coming from a common ancestor that flew over from the mainland, but changed to become different as they diversified and moved into different habitats. If you look at the beaks on the finches, they're different. And remember we said bird beaks are adaptations to help you get food. So birds that have different beaks, it's because they're eating different kinds of foods. If you eat seeds, you need a different kind of beak than if you're a meat eater. If you're drinking nectar, if you're eating hard nuts, if you're picking berries, you need different kinds of beaks to be able to allow you to get the kind of foods that you need. And remember, we talked about niche and where you fit in, and even if you live in the same place, eating different kinds of foods. The Galapagos finches show that change over time from a common ancestor. If Darwin's theory is correct, you'd also expect to find different species, but living far apart on the planet, maybe different continents, but because they're living in similar habitats, becoming more alike as they adapt to their ecosystems. If you have an adaptation, a body part that helps you live in a certain environment, then we would expect to see organisms, even though they don't share a recent common ancestor, becoming more alike, more similar, as those body parts help them survive in their place. And we also see that pattern as well. If you look at the organisms, these two organisms, sugar glider lives in Australia, flying squirrels in North America. They live in very similar ecosystems, but they come from very different ancestors. Sugar gliders are marsupials. Marsupials are organisms that have a pouch, like a kangaroo. And flying squirrels in North America are not marsupials. They don't have a pouch, but they live in very similar ecosystems, and they've come to have a similar characteristics because it helps them survive in their place that they live. They're adapted to similar environments, but they evolved from different ancestors. That ability to kind of spread the skin between their legs. They don't flap their wings and fly like a bird, but they can glide. They leap from tree to tree, and spreading out the skin between their legs allows them to kind of glide from place to place. And even though very different ancestors, they've adapted similar characteristics to live in the place that they live because they live in a similar kind of habitat. Whales and sharks are another example. They have a very similar body shape, even though they are very different organisms. One's a fish, one's a mammal, but because they live in the similar ecosystem in a watery place, they have independently adapted to the place that they live, and they causes them to look alike. They have fins for swimming in water, long streamlined bodies, even though they come from different ancestors. The idea of changing to become more alike is called convergent evolution. Converge means to come together. In organisms that have evolved to fit the places that they live, are becoming more alike, becoming more similar. That's an example of what we call convergent evolution. If you think about organisms and the ideas of change over time, whales and wolves don't look very much alike at all, but they share a common ancestor. They're both mammals. And they have changed over time to fit the places where they live. That would be examples of divergent evolution, common ancestor changing to become different species. Whales and sharks are not related, they're distantly related, but they look and act more alike. Those would be examples of convergent evolution. Fish and mammals, different ancestors converging, coming together because they live in a similar place. And what's driving the change over time is the environment, the pressure of the environment, who's going to survive and live in that place. We are going to stop right there. Stay tuned for the rest of our evidence for Darwin's theory.